Hello everybody and welcome. Let's start off by having a look at all of you. Just have a good look at all of the people in the audience. Because what you're looking at is the most remarkable organism on this planet, possibly even in the universe. Something more advanced and sophisticated than the most complicated computer we could ever build. And it's you and how your bodies stay alive that we're going to talk about today. Each one of your bodies contains 100 million different cells. And every one of those cells is changing continuously. It's working to keep its own internal environment constant. It's working independently. But more importantly than that, the cells in your body are having to work in coordination. They're having to adjust, to sense, to adapt, to respond to the many changes going on around you all of the time, in order that they can regulate your bodies and help them stay in balance. So when does this regulation actually begin? Is it when you're born or even earlier? Well, to help us to understand that, I'd like you to welcome our first guests, and this is Penny and Brian. Hello, Brian. Hello, Penny.
Hello.
Isn't he lovely? Well, Brian. So can you tell us a bit about Brian?
Well, Brian's about 22 weeks old, and
Yeah,
he's
it's
a
all right,
little
don't worry.
orphan that we've had to hand rear.
Oh, poor Brian. So without Penny, Brian wouldn't be alive now. That's all right.
He'll hold on to you. You don't need to worry about him falling.
Isn't he gorgeous? So Brian's only a little baby, quite helpless without Penny. But as you can see, Brian's already quite advanced. He's having a good look at you all, and he's not too happy about you. There we go. He's happy like that. So Brian can balance quite well. He's already balancing there, having a good look around. He's listening, he's watching, making a few noises. And in fact, within Brian's body, there's also a remarkable network of sensors, checking on the temperature, the levels of oxygen, the acidity, telling him when he should eat, when he should breathe, and when he should sleep. So Brian is already regulating his body. Well, Brian, where are we going now? There, hang on. Oh, can't just run away. Never mind, Brian. So we've seen an example of just a baby animal that's managing to regulate the systems within his body in response to the changing environment around him. But that's only just the beginning, because this regulation doesn't just have to cope with the changes going on in the outside world, changes like the temperature, the amount of food and water, the light, but also the continuing changes that are going on in all of your bodies. So now we're going to try to understand something about this regulation. How do we do this? Well, it's quite complicated, but in fact, biology isn't so different to the basic principles that operate in engineering. And here we have a lovely example of that regulation in engineering. This is Ron. Thank you, Ron, for coming along.
Hello.
And what have we got here?
We have a boiler providing steam to our miniature engine, which has a governor on it, which you're going to explain to us.
Well, I'm not an expert on steam engines, I'm afraid, but this system is actually quite simple. The engine is being driven by steam generated in the boiler. The steam is delivered to the engine via a valve. More steam, the engine goes faster. But the engine has to be regulated, and it's regulated by this little thing here whizzing round called a governor. If we just stop it for a moment, you can see that this governor involves two balls that, as the engine goes faster, they move apart like this through centripetal force, and as the engine slows down, they move back together again. And when the engine's going fast and the balls move apart, that operates a stopper, a rod, which shuts down the amount of steam going to the engine, so it slows down. When it slows down, the governor balls move back together again, and the engine gets a bit more steam. So now we're going to start it going again, and you can see that the engine's working, the balls on the governor are moving out and continuously regulating the rate that the engine is going at. So this is important for keeping the speed of the engine in check, keeping it carefully regulated. Without the governor, too much steam and it might race out of control. It's a very simple example of feedback, feeding back to the engine to keep it regulated. Thank you very much indeed. What you've just seen is a beautiful example of regulation in engineering. The steam engine, of course, was invented in about 1712 in England. But it was over 100 years later before a scientist started to understand that the same principles were operating in biology. And this scientist was a man called Claude Bernard. Claude Bernard was a very clever experimental physiologist. Just like me, he was trying to understand how our bodies work. He looked at quite a number of different parts of the body. He tried to study digestion, for example, how we digest our foods. He tried to look at metabolism and a variety of changes that occur when we eat. But there was one question that fascinated Claude Bernard. And the question was, how do we manage to survive in a world that's changing around us? And he realized that we do this by keeping things the same inside our bodies. He actually said it's the fixity, the consistency, he meant, of the inside of our bodies that allows us to live a free and independent life. And by understanding this, he changed our thinking of biology. It wasn't until some time later that we realized that the same principles apply to all organisms, to the whole of life. The term was coined homeostasis, keeping the same. And what we're going to try to do now is to understand something about this homeostasis. How do we regulate things to keep the inside of our bodies the same? Well, in fact, it can be quite difficult to study this problem in complicated people like us. But another way of looking at it is to go very simple. Let's look at much more simple organisms than us. Let's look, for example, at bacteria. And we've got some here under the microscope that we're going to have a look at. Okay, now, if I show you these bacteria, if you can look very carefully here, these are these little things darting about. These small bacteria, called vibrios, come from the oceans. And they're actually less than 1,000th of a millimetre in length, so they're very small. But you can see that they're swimming around quite nicely. And in fact, they're swimming at a speed of 60 microns a second. Doesn't sound very much, but if that was the equivalent of us swimming, it'd be 150 miles an hour, so they can move around pretty fast. And they do this because they've got tiny biological electric motors in them. These little bacteria evolved about 2 billion years ago, long time ago, so they're very simple. But actually, they can do some very interesting things. They're not just moving about randomly here, it might look like they are, but they're sensing, they're trying to detect what's happening around them. And if we look at an edge, for example, here, this is the edge of the liquid where the bacteria are living, and on this side is air or oxygen. What they're doing is they're starting to congregate along this edge. They know that they need oxygen. And these bacteria don't just sense oxygen, they can also sense a whole variety of things, like the chemicals in the liquid they're living in, the temperature and the acidity. And each of these bacteria can sense these things, move towards the things that are going to be helpful to them, and away from those things that are going to be harmful. So now we're starting to see that even the simplest of organisms, in order to stay alive and maintain their body in balance, must sense the world around them. And we do exactly the same thing. We're going to look at this now, but I'm going to need a couple of helpers. Any volunteers for me from the audience? Okay, where are we going? Okay, we get one on the end there. Do you want to come round? Okay, and then we'll have another one over here. Another one to come down, yeah, in the black t-shirt and stand here. Okay, that's good. If you can stand over here, it's very good. Yeah, what's your name?
Lizzie.
Lizzie, hello Lizzie. What's your name?
Ben.
Hello Ben. Okay, stand round here. Right, want to put your arms out, just forward a little bit, so I've got room here. Okay, put your arms out. Okay, now, I want you to stand on one leg, hold your leg right up high. Okay? Very good. You're pretty good at balancing, aren't you? Now, keep your legs up, don't put them down, stay where you are. Put your arms down. Very good. Now close your eyes. Oh, we've got a bit of a wobble on here, yeah, and here as well. Okay. It's not actually so easy. You can put your leg down now. Okay. Thanks very much. You can actually go back to sit down again now. Thank you. This is a very simple demonstration, but it tells you that they're using numerous senses just to do something that seems very simple. We are coordinating. And now we're going to look at an even more remarkable feat of coordination. This, I should say, is Howie. And Howie isn't just balancing on one leg, he's balancing on a single wheel. And even more than that, he's going to manage to juggle as well. Howie tells me he hardly even thinks about it, and he never falls off. Unless, of course, he wants to. Well, pretty good demonstration of coordination. In fact, we humans are quite good at a lot of senses. We're extremely good all-rounders. We can smell quite well, we can hear, we can taste, we can coordinate. But evolution is such that some animals, some organisms, have developed highly specialised senses which allows them to adapt and thrive in a special niche in the environment. Let's just look at one or two of these special senses. The kestrel can spot its tiny prey down on the ground over a mile away. The scorpion can sense with these tiny fibres minute movements. Many animals, like the fennec fox, can hear with these huge ears. And the snake, of course, tastes his way around. All of these are specially adapted senses, much better than ours. Now, sometimes we can manage to use animals with these senses to our best advantage. To have a look at that, I'd like to welcome our next guests, which are Gary and Buddy. Hello, Gary. Right. Thanks for coming along.
Okay.
Hello, Buddy. How are you? Hello. Oh, yeah, have a good look around, eh? So, Gary, can you tell me a bit about Buddy?
Yeah, Buddy uses his sense of smell to find explosives for the police.
So, why have we got him here today?
Well, we've got a small piece of explosives out there under a seat.
Don't worry, it's far too small to cause any damage, no problem.
There's no detonator at all. So.
No, nobody look, just stay where you are.
And hopefully Buddy's going to find it for us.
Right, hopefully he's going to find it. Now, remember this is a dog that has to use its sense of smell. Hopefully you can't smell the explosive. So, are you going to go then, Buddy?
Right, so when he finds the explosive, he's going to bark.
Okay, right, so don't worry, he won't be upset. Sit. Nothing yet.
Bud, come. What you got?
Oh, hang on, who's answering? Now, Gary's colleague's going to tell us, is there anything there, in fact? Can we see anything there? Yes, we can. So he did manage to find the explosive. Well done, and thank you very much indeed for coming along. Dogs, as you probably know, have a sense of smell about 30 times better than ours. But that's actually nothing compared to the animal I'm going to show you now, which we won't bring in, because that animal is the shark. Sharks have a sense of smell about 11,000 times better than us. We all know what they're particularly good at smelling: blood. they can detect one particle of blood in 1 million parts of water, swim straight towards it, and we know what they do then. Now, some humans can adapt their senses. Howie had clearly fine-tuned his coordination. The perfumist can distinguish perhaps 1,000 different fragrances. The wine taster will tell you not just what sort of wine it is and what year, but sometimes even which side of the valley it came from. But there's another world out there that's hard for us to imagine. Animals with senses that we have absolutely no knowledge of. And let's look at a few examples of these. Snakes, for example, detect their prey from tiny changes in temperature. And this infrared is showing what the prey looks like to a snake. Other animals can find their way around the world just by using magnetism. This duck-billed platypus, for example, can detect tiny electric currents, and that's the way he seeks out his prey and communicates. Now, we, of course, can detect electric currents, particularly if they're high enough, and they actually give you a shock. And there are many animals, for example, fish, that use electric jolts to zap their prey. But there are others, we've got some of them here today, that use tiny electric currents to sense what's going on around them. The fish here is called a knife fish, and he comes from the freshwater rivers of South America. And what we've done is we've put 2 electrodes in here to see if we can pick up the electrical currents that he's sending out. These are very, very tiny currents, and we'll have to listen very carefully to see if we can pick something up. Can you hear that hum? That's the sound of the fish sending out an electrical charge. A small hum. Okay, so now we're going to take it out and we're going to have a look at a different sort of fish. Because in here, we've got another fish that sends out a very tiny electrical charge. And this is called an elephant nose fish, and he comes from Africa. Can you hear? And as he moves around, the sound changes. These 2 fish are using exactly the same principle to sense what's going on around and to send out signals. They're both using electrical charges. But of course, the 2 of them are using slightly different languages. This one is using a whining, high-pitched sort of sine wave that we pick up as a mm, and this one is sending out individual signals. Now we've seen just a snapshot of the amazing world of the super senses. Imagine how different your world would be if you could taste pure water. You know exactly how to get home again just by detecting the magnetic field of the Earth. If you could tell as soon as somebody had walked into your house from the heat they gave off or the smell. These are all examples of remarkable senses which we don't know much about. Now we've looked at a number of different senses, but this is only the beginning of the story of understanding regulation. The next stage is to look at what response occurs after you've sensed something. We've looked mainly so far at the senses in you that you know about, sensing the outside world, that take a little while to think about. But other senses, of course, we do quite quickly and without thinking about. That was pretty quick. Well done. Have it back again. Thank you. Oh, you're better than I am. Didn't even think about that, just automatically put out his hands. That's, if you like, a sort of reflex response that occurs very quickly, much more quickly than the responses you see when you're deciding or thinking about something. So how are we now going to be able to tell the difference between a variety of different responses? Perhaps we could begin by measuring how long they take. Is it true that this one is quicker than another one, or a reflex is quicker than a response you think about? Well, the equipment coming along now is going to help us to answer this, and we've got a volunteer already. So what we're going to do now is measure the time for different sorts of responses. Marina here is going to help me. Do you want to have a seat, Marina? Would you feel more comfortable down there? If you can just move it around here a little bit so you're a bit closer to me. Can you just pull it along? No, you can't, sorry. As you're wired up, there you go. Okay. You just rest there for a moment, because what we've got are some electrodes here on Marina, on her arm. You just have a look at these. And these are measuring the electrical activity in her arm as her muscles move. Okay, we're not started yet, but if you just do this with your hand, right, once we get started, we'll be able to pick up the electrical charges resulting from her squeezing her hand, known as electromyograph. And what we're going to do first is see how fast her reaction time is. Because as soon as I make contact between this hammer and this piece here, it's going to trigger the computer to time the response. I'm going to ask Marina in a moment to squeeze her hand, and when she does, we'll pick up the movement in her arm, as we'll show on the computer screen. Now, you ready for all this? You're ready for all this, so you're going to be quick, okay? So as soon as I just tap this piece of foil here, you're going to squeeze your hand. Okay, ready? Wait for it. Okay, we didn't get anything here. Let's try it again. Okay, you ready? And yes, there we go, beautiful trace. Now, I don't know if you can see this, if you can't, here's where I hit with the hammer, and after a little pause, this is the electrical activity in Marina's arm. And we can count across here the time scale, and it's just over 100 milliseconds. That's about 1/10 of a second. So you're pretty fast. Right, now we're going to do it again. So we do it again. Okay, you ready again? Yes. And almost exactly the same response time, about 1/10 of a second. Now we're going to do something different. You're not going to do anything. You're going to completely relax, because I'm just going to make you do something. Completely relax, she says. Okay, I'm going to try to cause a reflex response in Marina's arm. It's going to be a very similar response that the doctor tries out on you when you have your knee and you go like that and it kicks, okay? And now we're going to see if that causes a change in her muscle. So now I'm going to bash her heavily on her arm. We're going to see what happens. Right, okay, now I don't know if you saw, but here, very quickly, is a rapid change. Let's just try that again and see if it's the same. Here it is. Okay. This response caused her arm to twitch within just a few milliseconds, less than 1/100th of a second, whereas this response occurs much, much later. And don't forget, we're still only talking within 1 second. So we can see that some responses, even though they're just going like this, occur over much different time periods to others. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Marina. We'll now let you go. So, why should it be that some responses take a long time and others take very little time? What's the difference between them? Well, the difference we find is in the way they're handled on the circuits through which they travel. And to look at this, we have here a model of a head and inside it a model of a brain. And we can look at examples of where electrical activity is happening in the brain by lighting up different parts of it. So, for example, when I'm talking, I'm spending most of today doing, this part of my brain lights up. When I look at something, a different part of my brain, the activity is increased. And then when I have to have conscious control over my movement, another part of the brain is activated. All of these are in the upper parts of the brain called the cortex, quite complicated areas, lots of circuits. So it takes a bit longer for messages to be relayed through these higher parts of the brain. Now, other reflexes, for example, when you cough, you sneeze, you breathe, these are handled by areas much lower down in the brainstem, and these are activated when you have reflexes. So these sort of responses tend to be much quicker. But the very fastest response, the response we saw in Marina when I tapped her on the wrist, is a reflex. It doesn't need the brain at all. It just relies on signals sent very rapidly to the spinal cord and back again. And in fact, some of the fastest messages in our nerves can travel at 500 miles an hour. So now we've looked at a whole variety of different responses to a number of different signals. But these are still all external things, things you look at in the world around you, things you all know about, really, I suppose. What we're going to do now is to try and think about responses within your body. Remember Brian and the bacteria, who weren't even thinking about keeping themselves alive, but they were still regulating all the time. So we're going to think about something that you can't taste, you can't smell, but without it, you'd be unconscious in about 4 or 5 minutes, you'd be dead in 10 minutes. Well, of course, I'm talking about oxygen. This room is 1/5 full of oxygen, but you can't tell how much is there. But of course you can, or at least your body can, because oxygen is one of the most important things, not just for you, but for the whole of life. For the bacteria we saw, for Brian, for the fish, and for many other organisms. So it's not surprising that the mechanisms regulating the amount of oxygen that goes to your cells are extremely important. And that's what we're going to look into now. We're going to try to understand how each one of these mechanisms works so that you can stay alive and your cells get enough oxygen. Well, what is the first way we get oxygen? Well, that's not very difficult, is it? We breathe. Okay, oxygen goes into the lungs. From there, of course, it has to be taken up into the blood. We know that the lungs are especially well prepared to take up oxygen from the blood because they have an extremely rich blood supply. This is a resin cast of the blood vessels in a real human lung. You can see the hugely dense blood vessels, each one of these tiny vessels that carries blood to the lungs so that it can pick up oxygen and carry it to the cells where it's needed. So now we're going to try and look at how does the blood carry oxygen. Just before the lecture, a friendly doctor came along and took some blood from me. And we have some of this blood in a syringe here. This is actually real blood, that one isn't. And Elia's now going to have a look under a microscope to see what my blood is like. So just put a tiny bit onto there. Okay, probably a bit too much there, but never mind. He's now going to put this under the microscope so we can look inside my blood to see how it carries oxygen to the rest of my body. We know probably that the blood contains cells, just like the rest of the body. So let's just have a look. What you can see here are the hundreds of red blood cells in my blood. And it's these red blood cells that are important for carrying oxygen. Without them, I'd probably be dead. And that's why when you don't have enough oxygen, if you live, for example, at high altitude, you'll get more red blood cells. And we've adapted a remarkable way of carrying oxygen because those red blood cells contain a protein called hemoglobin. And we know that when that hemoglobin's carrying oxygen, it'll be red, and when it's not, it's dark. Here again, some samples of blood taken from me earlier today. And this one here has had oxygen bubble through it, just as though it had been in the lungs. It's bright red because the hemoglobin has turned it red. And this is my venous blood, which is darker because it doesn't have so much oxygen in it. The hemoglobin has now lost the oxygen. So the hemoglobin picks up the oxygen from the lungs, takes it to the cells where it's needed, and delivers it to those cells. Many other animals also use hemoglobin, but not all of them do. In fact, this chap we have here is rather different. I'm not very good at this, I don't think. So here we have a lobster. I'm treating him very cautiously because you can see he's got great long grabbing things. Okay. In fact, it's a she actually. It's a lady lobster because she's got some eggs. Hello. Okay, we'll just put her back for a moment, but before we do, if you just have a look here, do you notice she's rather blue? Yeah, she's not cold. Right, in you go again. Get that in there. Okay, thank you. Right, yes. Yeah, well, never mind. If you want to stay there, then fine. We won't argue. Right. Lobsters look blue. They are blue. Okay, could you stay down there? And in fact, we took a little bit of blood from the lobster earlier, just like we did from me. She didn't mind any more than I did. And when we first take the blood, it's clear. It's see-through. Okay? But as soon as we bubble oxygen through it, it doesn't go red like my blood. It goes blue. This. And the reason it goes blue is because instead of having hemoglobin like us, that turns red when it carries oxygen, this lobster has hemocyanin, a copper-based compound that turns blue when it carries oxygen. Almost exactly the same principle. Now, we've heard a little bit about the blood that carries the oxygen around. Well, humans have known about blood for a very long time. It's not surprising, really, is it? Because, of course, even the ancient Britons, or the ancient man, when he bled, he'd know it was pretty serious. And if that blood came out red, it'd be even more serious, probably an artery. But it was the early scientists had some very strange ideas about how blood was carried around the body. In fact, most of the ideas date back to the year 300 AD. And a very famous Turkish scientist called Galen came up with a lot of ideas, and he suggested that blood is made in the liver, and it's made from food. From the liver, goes to the heart, it picks up vital spirits onto the brain, where it picks up animal spirits, and then a bit vague about where it went after that. Those ideas, strange though they may seem, in fact prevailed for over 1200 years. People still believed that blood was made in the liver and that the arteries just opened like bellows and the blood filled into it. All of these things stayed in everybody's minds until the work of a remarkable man called William Harvey. William Harvey trained as a doctor in Cambridge, and then he went off to Italy for a year or two. And when he came back to London, he got himself a fairly good job. He was the court physician to the kings. He also worked at St. Bartholomew's Hospital for about 30 years, looking after sick people. But in spite of his time spent looking after people, Harvey's real true love was trying to understand the body, and particularly trying to understand about the circulation and the blood. He was never happy with these ideas of Galen's that blood was produced in the liver. So he did a number of experiments on dead bodies, dead animals, some of them on live animals. For example, he took a snake and he cut it, and when he cut an artery, he noticed that the blood always flowed out away from the heart. On the other hand, when he cut a vein, it always flowed out towards the heart. So he started to wonder whether or not Galen was right. But as well as doing some horribly gory experiments, Harvey, like most good scientists, also did some very simple ones on himself. And some of those experiments you can see up here, which he did on his veins. And you can try these out yourself when you get home. But for now, we're going to look at exactly what Harvey did. We won't use my veins because they're not particularly good. So we're going to have a look at Elia's veins, which are a great deal better. Let's have a look around. Oh, wonderful veins, Elia. Okay. So what Harvey did was he stroked his finger down his vein. You notice that when he did, you can still see the vein, but now there's no blood in it. If you let go of it, blood suddenly come back again. And do that again. Emptying the blood out and releasing it, and it comes back in again. But then, when he stroked it the opposite way, the blood stayed there. Didn't empty anymore. Let me try that again. So stroking it this way didn't remove the blood. Now, as a result of these experiments, Harvey put together some of the most fascinating ideas on the circulation. It was Harvey who realised that the blood is carried around the body, it comes out of the heart in the major arteries, and it returns to the heart again in the veins. Now, as a result of all these studies, of course, Harvey started to understand the circulation. He also wanted to know about exactly what it was that was pumping the blood around the body. He still didn't believe Galen. And one of the ways he found out that what we know now, it's the heart, was because he took the hearts out of dead humans and he weighed the amount of blood. He squeezed it out and weighed it. And he found that a heart normally contains about 2 ounces of blood. Now, he also knew that a heart beats at a rate of about 70 a minute, so he worked out that the heart must be pumping out about 8 pounds of blood a minute. It's not far off our current day estimates. But clearly it was far too much to be made every minute from the liver. And he realised the importance of the heart as the main pump sending blood around the body. Nowadays, again, of course, we can look at the heart, we can use various techniques to follow its movement within the body. This is a CT scan of a real heart beating and pumping blood out. Now, Harvey, of course, didn't understand all of the workings of what was going on in the heart. He didn't have the equipment available to him. He did, though, realise that the heart was capable of beating independently of the rest of the body. One of the ways he did this was because he noticed that when an animal died, he could feel its heart pulsating under his finger for up to an hour. So he then found out that the heart didn't need the rest of the body to pump. It could pump independently. And what we know now is not just the heart, but every single tiny cell within the heart can beat. We've got here some cells from a heart that we've grown in a dish in a culture, and we're going to see if we can possibly look at one of them. This isn't very easy, and Ilya's at the moment trying to find some cells in the dish. Can you just try a little bit of focus on it? No, back again. Okay. Now these are very precious, these cells, but within this dish, what you're seeing up here, if you look very carefully, is an individual heart cell. It's there under the microscope and it's beating. Each one of the cells in your heart is able to beat independently. And when they're all put together in a dish, they all beat in time. It's not always quite the right time, because of course, when they're together in a heart, we have a pacemaker that keeps them at the right time. We also have nerves controlling the heart, which can make it beat faster or slower. But nevertheless, the heart has to keep a constant rate while you're sitting around in order to deliver blood around to the rest of the body, in order to deliver the oxygen to those cells to keep them alive. So now we're going to look at what a heart rate is like. We're going to actually watch it. And for this, we've got a volunteer, I think, who was prepared earlier. This is Ian. Okay, Ian, do you want to sit down here? And Ian is all wired up with electrodes here. You're quite happy there, Ian? Yep. Good. And being displayed on here is the electrical signals coming from his heart, because this is an electrocardiogram, an ECG. It's exactly the same thing that you see in hospitals. And the waveform here are the electrical changes that are occurring as his heart contracts and relaxes and the signals are being sent around it. Now, in fact, Ian is quite remarkable for somebody who's obviously a little bit nervous, because his heartbeat at the moment is just 69. It's a very low resting heart rate, and that's extremely good. His heart, though, has to carry on beating like this for a very long time. It has to keep sending the blood all around the body. But how can we imagine what the heart is like, how strong it is, how much endurance it's got? Well, we're going to try and just look at this. We're going to look at it by each of you being a heart. Now, hopefully you may have one of these balls, do you? Okay. What we're going to imagine now is your hand, just take the ball in your right hand, your hand is a heart. Okay. In fact, my hand's about the right size. And it's going to squeeze, and the squash ball is going to be the blood. Okay? We're now going to start beating and squeezing that blood out in time with Ian's heart. Okay, everybody, start and squeeze, 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 squeeze. Come on, harder, everybody. Come on, squeeze, 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 squeeze. Keep squeezing, squeeze, squeeze. Keep going. And now Ian is going to start running about a bit. Okay, come on, faster, squeeze, squeeze, harder. You've got to get that blood down to his legs now. Harder, 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 harder. Come on, come on, harder. Come on, some of you giving up. Come on, squeeze, 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 squeeze. His legs are not getting enough oxygen. Come on. Okay, stop. Well, fortunately, he's still alive. You're all dead. Because, of course, if your heart stops just for a minute, you're going to be dead. Just think then how difficult it is to squeeze for only 30 seconds when your heart's, Ian's heart, hopefully, is going to carry on beating for probably another 70 years, another 2 billion beats. You think his heart's got a hard time, and Ian can probably just move over here now. Okay, thanks, and sit down comfortably. Okay, think his heart's got a hard time, your hand's found it difficult. What about other poor little animals? What about this little animal, for example? A tiny shrew. Listen to his heartbeat. 500 beats a minute. And for a pygmy shrew, more than 1,000 beats a minute. At the other end of the spectrum, the giant blue whale. Listen very carefully for his. It's very low, so you can hardly hear it, and it's also almost 6 seconds in between each beat, because the giant blue whale has a heart rate of only about 15 a minute. But of course, he can pump huge amounts of blood because his heart is about the size of a cow, and he can pump out more than 125 litres a minute. Put another way, our hearts could fill a petrol tanker with blood, if we wanted them to, in about 4 days. The blue whale could do it in 15 minutes. So now we're starting to see it's not just the rate the heart beats that might be important, it's the volume it beats as well. Because different animals have different amounts of blood, and therefore their hearts have to work at different rates. That tiny little shrew, for example, has only this much blood in the whole of his body. So how much blood have we got in our bodies? Well, Elia, perhaps you can show us. Okay, thank you. Right, this is about the amount of blood in each of our bodies. In fact, it's about 5 litres, about 8 pints, and it's extremely heavy. So I'm going to pass it back to Elia. But this is the amount of blood in your body, but it's also the amount that your heart is pumping around your body every single minute, just as you're sitting there resting, before you even do anything. So just imagine then, your hearts were squeezing so hard, your hands were squeezing so hard, but your heart's having to pump that amount of blood around your body every single minute. And if it doesn't, the cells in your body are not going to get the oxygen they require just to survive. Well, we've seen a little bit already about the heart. It's clearly quite remarkable, and it's obviously essential to provide the oxygen that we need. But it has to do more than that. The heart has to do more than just sit there and pump blood and oxygen to the tissues. It's changing all the time. What I'd like you to do now is all put up your right hand, high in the air, and the other hand down. And just leave it there for a moment. We're now going to have a look at Ian. Got a heart rate over here of about 80. And Ian, I'd like you to stand up. Keep your hands in the air. What we're doing now is changing the distribution of blood in your body. As Ian stood up, the blood's rushing down towards his feet. So his head doesn't have as much blood in it as before. Keep your hands up. Sometimes when you stand up too suddenly, you feel faint and you fall over again. But fortunately, the heart can cope. It's compensated. So Ian's heart rate has already gone up to 108. And what's happened with your hands is the blood's run away. So if we now put them down and have a look, you should see one hand is paler than the other. But of course, you can sit down now, thank you, Ian. But of course, it's no good if you keep your hand up like this, if it dies because it doesn't get enough oxygen. That'd be no good. What happens is the heart has to respond. It's got to get the oxygen right up here, and it's got to get the oxygen up to Ian's brain when he stands up. Otherwise, we die. In order to do this, it has to pump out at a fair old pressure. So we're now going to try to understand, how does it keep that pressure up? What sort of pump is the heart? Or we can look at the heart as a very simple sort of pump like this. It could either be one that pumps out continuously at the same rate, or it could be one that pumps out in spurts. And if you can see here without me drenching myself, this is how the heart works. And now it's going faster. Elia's running quickly now and his heart's going. It comes out in it's going out in spurts. As the heart squeezes, the pressure goes up, and as the heart relaxes, the pressure goes down. Thank you very much, Elia. And what that means is that there are at least two pressures in your arteries. It's changing all the time between a high pressure, as the heart's squeezing, and a lower pressure as it's relaxing. Now, this pressure is extremely important because every time we stand up, we lie down, we do this, we have to regulate the amount of blood and the amount of oxygen supplied to each part of the body. We have to be adjusting the pressure all the time. This is a problem for us. Just imagine what a problem it is for animals like this. This poor guy, the giraffe, it's about 15 feet from the floor to the top of his head. He has to have an incredibly strong heart and a very high blood pressure, about 240 millimetres in fact. If he was unfortunate enough to cut a major artery, then the blood would spurt at least 10 feet into the air. But then when you think about it, giraffe's got to get the blood all the way up to the top of his head. What happens when he puts his head down again to eat? Why doesn't it explode? Well, he's got amazing adaptation because in his head he's got these spongy tissues around the main blood vessels that take up the pressure when he goes like this, so he doesn't get a crushing headache every time he wants to bend down. Another example of a beautifully adapted regulation. So now we've started to see something about the senses, we've seen something about the regulation of the most important thing to all life, of oxygen, regulating the heart, regulating the blood flow, regulating the pressure in order that your cells just get enough oxygen. But that, of course, isn't the end of it. There are a number of other different things that the heart has to respond to. Let's just have a look now at how Ian's heart rate's doing. How are you doing over there, Ian? Okay, his heart rate at the moment is about 84. Okay. Right. It's now gone up. You heart in 91, 92. Everybody else's heart rate has gone up as well. And we're shooting up 93 now. What you've just seen is another beautiful example of your body regulating. What that's called is the fight and flight response. When you hear something that might be a bit dangerous, like an explosion, for example, or something running towards you, your brain goes, danger, either run away, do something, fight, get ready to do something quickly. And that's why Ian, very quickly, his heart rate, boom, shot up, danger, and now it's coming down again. What thy brain is doing is activating a branch of the nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system, releasing chemicals, adrenaline or noradrenaline, that are getting everything in your body ready to go, to get that oxygen to those cells that need it. And in fact, this begins even before you know that something's happening, even before you actually start to do something. You can anticipate, for example, when you're about to run a big race. Imagine then, for example, a major athlete like Linford Christie standing on the blocks. He's already getting ready to run that big race. Even before he moves, that gun fires, already his heart rate's going boom, 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 his hands will be sweating, he's ready, and he's away. So before he ever leaves those blocks, he is already in a position to run very fast. Now, we've heard quite a lot about different parts of this regulation. What we're going to do now is try to bring it all together in one last demonstration. We're going to look at the supply of oxygen to the whole body and the sort of regulation is required to keep that up when you're exercising. Earlier on today, they had me on this bicycle connected to this computer. With the equipment we have here, we can measure not only the heart rate, but also the amount of oxygen consumed by the whole body. And we can determine from this exactly the levels of oxygen in the blood. And we were able to see what happened to me. I can now show you what happened. Now, I'm not extremely fit. Nevertheless, I was working hard here just before lunchtime on this bicycle. You see, I was connected up, measuring my oxygen consumption and heart rate with everybody shouting, faster, faster. We're measuring on the equipment what happened. Well, what I can tell you is my resting heart rate, not surprisingly, I was quite busy, was about 90. When I was exercising hard, went up to about something like 140. My resting oxygen consumption, about 200. then shot up when I was exercising. So you can see on the left, the blue line, as it's steady, I was resting, and then I started to exercise, it started to move up. And on the right, my heart rate, a few odd little spikes there, but it went up because of the extra oxygen demands on my body. Now, I'm not very fit, and I thought I'd done fairly well on here. But of course, there are many other people that are much, much better at exercising than me. Let's look, for example, at some of the best cyclists in the world. They're obviously much fitter than me. If you look here at the guy coming through at the back, this is Chris Boardman, Olympic gold medalist. His fancy bike and lovely helmet. Well, I suspect that Chris would do a bit better than me on the bike. He's probably a little bit better adapted. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to find out because we have Chris Boardman here today. Hi Chris, thanks for coming. Thanks very much for coming. Well, thank you very much for coming, Chris. Just make yourself comfortable, will you? I suspect the bike's probably the most comfortable place for you. It's quite as good as your bike, but anyway.
Serves the purpose.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to get you hooked up now gradually so we can be measuring your heart rate, we're going to be measuring your oxygen consumption, and then you're going to cycle. Now, you know the objective, don't you? You've got to do better than me.
I think that's plain and clear.
Right, I hope you can manage that. Right,
No.
okay. Now, what's your resting heart rate normally?
Well, it would normally be in the 40s in the off-season, which is right now, maybe in the 50s. But as you can see, I don't know about the fight and flight response. I'm now demonstrating the I know what's coming next response.
But just stop for a second there, 40. That's incredibly low. That's about half of my resting heart rate. Now, that is actually a very, very good indication of how fit Chris is. It means his heart's incredibly efficient. So how do you get that fit?
With a lot of work, really, and pushing your body and always making it do that just a little bit more than it's already comfortable with. And it takes a long period of time.
Yeah. So how far do you cycle every week?
Up to 500 miles in a week would be in the summer, and 90 races a year at over 200 kilometres a race in general. Pretty silly way to make a living, really.
Right, so he should be fit. Okay, yeah, pretty silly indeed. So
Right.
can you put this on and we're
I
going to
will.
get you hooked up. Okay, so now we're going to start measuring Chris's oxygen consumption. Okay, so you just sit there and relax for a moment, will you, Chris? Well, as you said, he's ready. He knows what's coming. His heart rate is already at 86, so he's already geared up. Not quite the normal resting level of 69, but never mind. Settle down for a minute. His body at the moment is using nearly 500 mils of oxygen a minute. That's already about twice what I was using. Not surprisingly, as he's a man and he's quite muscular. And on here, we can also see the saturation of oxygen in his blood. The number here you can see, 99, is the percentage saturation of his hemoglobin. 100% would mean that every single molecule of hemoglobin in every red blood cell in his body is full of oxygen. So it's pretty close, really. OK, Chris, I think we're ready to go. You start cycling. OK, get going. OK, he's cycling along now, getting going faster. This is already faster than I managed, I have to say. So what's happening now, in case you can't hear me, is that thousands of signals from Chris's muscles are telling his brain to breathe faster. His heart's already going faster, now up to 125 beats a minute, and he's using loads of oxygen. Go on, keep going, Chris. Gonna keep him going for a bit more. He's just 500 miles a week. This is nothing. His heart rate's now 180. OK, Chris, we'll let you stop now. Just you slow down. Well, have a look at what happened. Well, the first thing to look at, after he's been working so hard, is what's his blood oxygen like? Well, it's 98%. It's hardly shifted a single jot. We'll come back to that in a moment, because we're now going to look at what's happened over here. You just sit there and rest for a moment, Chris. No. Here, his oxygen consumption has shot up. This line is almost vertical. It's screamed up to a value of almost 5 litres a minute. That again suggests he's very fit because his muscles are adapted to going very fast and to using more oxygen. Here his heart rate Started off down here, a value of about 70, and screamed up to nearly 180. These values are quite different to my values, which we saw before. And on the right, my heart rate, well, jiggled about a bit, went up. So Chris is showing all the signs of a very, very fit and trained athlete. As soon as his muscles start working, and they work much harder than mine, his heart immediately shoots up to a value much greater than mine. So although athletes have lower resting heart rates, their maximum heart rates are usually higher. We also see that he can use a lot more oxygen. So what we've seen is that even though Chris's oxygen consumption went from 500 up to mils a minute up to nearly 5 litres, he's using now 10 times more oxygen. His body compensated. It regulated everything because the oxygen content of his blood, and therefore the oxygen going to his cells, was exactly the same. A beautiful example of regulation. We also see something very important here, that Chris recovers very quickly. A very important aspect of regulation, of homeostasis, is not just how much your body changes, but how quickly it comes back to normal again. And Chris is very well adapted, partly because of his very hard training, but I suspect he's also started off much better than me. And it may be that there are genes for performance and fitness. Just earlier this year, scientists think they may have discovered a tiny change in one of the genes that may be important in the very top athletes, the world-class athletes like Chris. So this has told you just a little bit about regulation. We've seen everything from how bacteria sense and need oxygen, how we get the oxygen through to our blood, and how a trained and adapted athlete is just so much better at doing it. I'd really like to thank you for the energy you've put into this today, Chris, and I'd like to give you a little something.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Can I open it now?
Yeah, open it now, please. Yeah, yeah.
Well, there's only one though.
Yeah, it's just one chocolate. Sorry about that, but actually, the amount of energy in that chocolate, the calories there, is almost exactly the same as the energy you burnt on that bike. Doesn't seem like very much, does it? About 50 calories.
Nout for nout.
But next time, in the next lecture, we're going to be understanding about energy, how we use it, where it goes, and what we eat. Thank you very much.